Universidad de Dresden, la Universidad Tecnológica de Dresden. Desde 1997 hasta ahora es investigador del Instituto Leibniz de Ecología Acuática y Pesquerías de Berlín, Alemania. Durante los últimos años, 20 años, ha sido jefe del Departamento de Pesquerías y de Ecología de Peces. Lleva 9 años siendo vicedirector del instituto. Desde 2025 es investigador jefe de su grupo. Y algo que es interesante y muy notable es que de 2018 a 2024 fue el presidente de la Sociedad Internacional de Limnología, que por sus siglas en inglés es el SIL. Entonces, es un gusto tener aquí a Tomás. Él nos va a dar una charla, en algún momento platicamos, que trata un poco sobre filosofía. En realidad no es una filosofía tan profunda, él nos decía, va a ser algo muy ligero. Nos va a hablar de su historia de vida, de cómo ha ido trabajando con este tipo de ambientes y con los peces. Entonces voy a pasar un poco al inglés para dar la bienvenida a Tomás. Al final va a haber una ronda de preguntas y respuestas. Si alguno de ustedes tiene problemas de comunicación con inglés, vamos a tener ayudándonos a Padmini. Padmini va entrando por ahí por las escaleras. Thomas, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here in our Congress, in the Mexican Congress of Limnology. Thank you very much. We are going to have at the end of your talking a session of questions and answers. We are going to have the advice of Padmini. Padmini is very fluent in Spanish and English. In case of the people need a translation from English to Spanish and vice versa. So you can talk whatever you want, you can answer whatever you want. Padmini is going to help us. So, Thomas, please continue with your talking. Thank you very much for being here. It's a very big pleasure. Your microphone is closed. Bueno, ahora iniciamos. Tuvimos un pequeño problemita allá arriba con las conexiones, pero finalmente lo logramos. Esperemos un momento. Okay, perfect. No, the microphone is again closed. If you can check. ¿Nos permiten el audio del doctor Mehner? Ahora, okay, if you talk a bit in order to know if you're... No se escucha. Bueno, mientras pueden ir leyendo un poco la presentación de Thomas. Uncovering the philosophical background that may shape limnological and ecological research on ponds. Es bien interesante, ya lo verán. Al principio, él ha sido uno de estos personajes que, como nosotros, han sido tachados de no limnólogos y más bien ecólogos. Entonces, él se ha dado la tarea de hacer esta búsqueda de identificarnos a nosotros, ¿no? Aquellos ecólogos que somos medio limnólogos, medio ecólogos, y a veces estamos en ese ámbito ambiguo de definiciones, ¿no? La limnología ha cambiado mucho y él es uno de estos ejemplos, ¿no? Así como Luis Zambrano ayer, Tomás ha pasado también por este periodo complejo de rechazo por parte de los limnólogos. Él mismo nos decía, les quiero dar una charla, pero es muy ecológica. ¿Será adecuado? Dice, Tomás, él ha escrito una serie de artículos muy bonitos, si los quieren buscar, de la época en que fue presidente de la Asociación Internacional de Limnología, en la que hace estas reflexiones, ¿no? De cómo es que la limnología, esta limnología, dependiendo de quién la haga, de quién nosotros nos consideremos limnólogos, ha pasado de ser esa etapa descriptiva de, como decía ayer Luis, ¿no? Del el pH sube, el pH baja, la bacteria sube, ha cambiado mucho. Ahora utilizamos esta forma de trabajo multidisciplinaria. Y Tomás nos va a presentar eso utilizando su investigación de años con peces y peces en toda Europa y algunos datos bien interesantes que él tiene. Tomás, are you in line?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. We now hear you.
Shall I start?
Okay, whenever you want, you can start.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Colleagues, I'm very happy that I get a chance to talk to you. So thanks for being invited as a keynote speaker to your Congress of the Mexican Limnology. And you certainly may have asked why the organizers have asked me to give a little bit insight also into philosophical thinking on top of studying ponds. And the reason was mentioned certainly already. I have given a keynote on the occasion of the 100th birthday of the International Society of Limnology 3 years ago, where I have covered diversity of researcher types and philosophical concepts. And certainly this was the motivation of the organizers to ask me again, adding a little bit on philosophy. I have to admit, of course, I'm not a philosopher by training. So it can be that I make mistakes with respect to the terms I'm using. But philosophy is anyway much more talking stories instead of delivering facts. And so at the end, all what I want to achieve is that you feel stimulated to think a little bit about your work in the context of philosophy. So no truths can be expected, just a stimulation of thinking. And you may ask yourself, in which way do you come in touch with philosophy? So what could be the initial step that you start thinking about philosophical concepts? And in my case, it was when I started teaching lake limnology. And I have to teach the students the importance of the electromagnetic spectrum. And of course, you certainly know it here between the two blue lines. We have a part of this electromagnetic spectrum, we have the infrared part of it that transfers heat into the lake, and then you have a vertical stagnation and vertical gradient in temperature. You have the visible light that, of course, is very important for directing interactions, all the visible interactions, for example, between predator and prey. And you have the ultraviolet part that essentially is dangerous for many animals, and therefore cladosans, for example, migrate down away from the surface. But the interesting point, if students ask back here, is we perceive this part of electromagnetic spectrum in a totally different way. Infrared is perceived by the sense of touch, while the visible is, of course, perceived by vision. And the ultraviolet, I mean, you don't perceive it directly, but you feel pain later if you have been exposed to ultraviolet. And you see, if you go to the radio or microwave, so to the long waves, and also to the extremely short ones, all these are perceived by instruments. And although this is not directly related to limnology, it is, of course, causes a massive question if we perceive things of the real world in a totally different way, by vision or by touch. Then the question is, do we talk about the same thing? So is all what we perceive the same, although we perceive it differently? So the question is here, what constitutes knowledge and how it is produced? And it is very clear that the world around us cannot be accessed directly. All what we need in the first place to get empirical knowledge is sensual perception. And we have additional power in our brain that are called experience and rationality, by which we can order and interpret these perceptions, but and this is very fundamental for philosophical thinking, we have to admit that this representation of a real world is not the world, but this is something what happens in our brains. And the consequence is that we have to exchange our thinking with other people by something that is not the direct sharing of knowledge, but you use language. And these make things much more complicated than you would think from the early beginning. And here with the ontology, so with philosophical study of being, it is very difficult to express what electromagnetic radiation is if it is perceived by different senses. So if you are very naive, you would say, well, something that you can see is different to something what you feel. Although you know from the physics it's the same. And I also at the end of a presentation will make a little, say, excursion into something what we call ethics or moral philosophy, because on top of experiencing things, perceiving the world, we also add something fundamental questions about right and wrong, so the nature of morality. So we interpret scientific results often by an evaluation of knowledge. And so we switch from a dichotomy between true versus false to something good versus bad. And I will later explain what I mean by this and why it is important in doing research. So what I will do during the next minutes, I will of course talk a little bit about ponds and their limnology. And initially I will start with biodiversity in ponds and correlates of biodiversity. But I will always close this presentation with some philosophical elements. So do we at all agree about what we study, and do we agree on how to predict biodiversity? I will then switch a little bit to species interactions within the framework of meta communities, but again questions emerge, how can interactions be studied at all? And in ecology in general, is causal inference possible? And finally, I will switch more to an applied aspect of this pond research, pond conservation, within the framework of nature's contributions to people. And I will ask, how do values affect our understanding and interpretation? And how can we transform the scientific system in a way to make our results relevant for society? The main pond data come from a huge project that we have been running for almost 4 years. This was called Pondiful. I don't think I have to introduce much to you about the importance of ponds. Ponds are quite frequent, so there are estimates that 50% of all standing waters worldwide may be ponds. They are very important for local and regional biodiversity, and they deliver several ecosystem services. And this was the motivation to deal more with ponds in Europe. And you see here on the right side in this scheme that we had typical research work packages. So we were focusing on biodiversity, ecosystem functions, vulnerability to climate change. We have used scenarios of modeling to later come to recommendations how to manage ponds. I would like to mention here that we also had a work package involved that explicitly focused on interactions with local stakeholders, and therefore policy and society played a role. And I will later tell you in which way there is a difference between our perception of what is important for pond conservation versus the perception of the pond stakeholders. What we have to mention always, at European level, if you apply for a project, one recommendation or one request rather is all the projects should have societal relevance. And often we have pre-formed consortia of natural researchers, and they think, we don't know exactly in which way we can do this kind of societal relevance. And so we ask normally colleagues from other disciplines, often sociology, sometimes politics, to contribute by their expertise to these projects. And on the first sight, it seems to be multidisciplinary, but in fact, the preformed consortia of natural scientists keep their elements of philosophical thinking, so they keep their roots in the nature. And this keeps something what I later will elucidate again, the nature-culture dichotomy. So there is a conflict between nature and culture, even in the design of these consortia. And the reason is something what we call epistemological sovereignty. This is our ontology. So the understanding of the world and how we perceive them is rooted in empirical research. And this is not true and not applicable to all the humanities that often use different ways of understanding of God and gaining knowledge. And this conflict at some point becomes important and needs to be resolved. So the typical research design was, and this is what I'm showing here, we study ponds. So there are pond variables, ecosystem functions, biodiversity. Here I will talk about the interactions, here about the correlation between biodiversity and pond variables. And then from this research, scenarios were planned and management recommendations given. And this is all within the domain of the scientific stakeholders, so natural researchers. And why focus on stakeholders, for example, landowners, farmers, NGOs, and politicians? We added an element that other scientific stakeholders from the domain of empirical socioecology studied the stakeholders by themselves. So we made the stakeholders an object of their study, and then this, say, knowledge about the stakeholders was part of the scenario development and ultimately the management recommendation. But it was not the case that the stakeholders directly were involved in scenario developing or even in management recommendations. So what are the origin of the pond data? We have been working in 8 countries, 6 really in the middle of Europe, plus Turkey, and more it's common that we add one country from the CELAC states. In that case, it was Uruguay. And we have really sampled 30 ponds per country, and each of the ponds were in clustered areas, what we call pondscapes. And on all these ponds we have listed, or we have studied a long list of pond characteristics, that is physics, chemistry, morphology. We have an explicit view on the biodiversity. We measured ecosystem functions, for example, greenhouse gas emissions or carbon sequestration, and we made a huge effort to map land use all around the pond. And as I've mentioned before, we had also 1 to 3 so-called demo sites, so places in all the countries where we interacted intensively with the stakeholders, and we used several questionnaires, and I will later show you at least one result from these questionnaires that is a little bit surprising in the context of pond conservation. Let me start with a very simple thing, just that you get a feeling about the ponds. Here you see a major gradient ordination just with respect to the major, say, axis of variability among the ponds. This is focused exclusively on the 6 countries from Europe, but what you can see generally, we have 2 big axes of variation. The one from left to right is related to the hydro period. That is simply whether a pond is permanently watered or sometimes fell dry. And this is clearly related to the temperature in the environment. So if it's hotter, the chance that a pond dries out is, of course, higher. And inversely, it is also related to fish. Fish don't survive very well in ponds where you have repeated drying out. And the second axis, that is the vertical one here, is clearly a eutrophication gradient. We have less exposed ponds, in particular in the north of Europe. So this is Denmark and UK a little bit, and the other side, the extreme ponds with extremely high nutrient concentrations are situated in Germany and a little bit in Belgium. And you see the yellow here up, this is Spain, these are the Spanish ponds, and these are quite different with respect to their characterization. These ponds are more often dry and on the other side, not very productive. And if we now switch to the predictors of species richness, here you see a list of several groups, so plankton, macroinvertebrates, submerged and emergent plants, and amphibians. And here a list of the predictors, what is very obvious at the early beginning, you see a lot of gray. So many of these predictors are not relevant for the groups shown here. And at the end, pond rise out is one of the main predictors for macroinvertebrates for plants. But it is surprising to see that in such a matrix of, say, 50 possible important predictors, very few are at the end strong enough to be significant. And the question is, of course, how can this happen? So what did we do wrongly about the selection of ponds or the selection of predictors that the predictive capability of our approach is not very high? And this is something where philosophy comes into place. Because you can, of course, use a definition for a pond. A pond is a small standing water with a surface area between 1 square meter and up to 5 hectares. And it can be permanent or seasonal, man-made or naturally created. And you have these 3 axes, that is the surface area, which is the depth, and also the percentage of emergent vegetation to discriminate ponds from wetlands. But if you talk about ponds with your colleagues, you all have a specific understanding what a pond is. So in philosophy, we would say it's rather a Platonic idea of a pond. But ponds are not realized as a Platonic idea. They are realized by concrete multiple particulars. And it really took us quite a number of months before we realized that our understanding of what a pond is substantially differed. So we all envisioned to work in the pond next to us, so in the proximity of our locations. But you see that the size differed, that the coverage by macrophytes substantially differed, that you see that water color differed, and even this pond, for example, here on top is, say, in a depression, whereas the other pond here is situated on top of a hill, of a little hill at least. And you can easily understand that this makes a substantial difference with respect to the effect of strong water flows and nutrient inflow into these ponds. So one of the reasons why we see such divergent results may simply be that we have not a full agreement about understanding what a pond is. And this becomes even more severe if we switch to biodiversity. We are all using biodiversity every day. We say biodiversity is something that is most important in considering why we need ponds. But what is biodiversity? And if you go into this, say, most comprehensive definition by Santana, you see it is species richness and abundance, it is genetic diversity, community ecosystem diversity, and even with differences in diversity between areas, so something like better diversity is included. And this makes things not easier, because if biodiversity is everything, what exactly shall be measured? And of course, the question is richness, as used in the analysis before, at all a good surrogate for what we need to know about biodiversity in ponds? I will come to all these questions again and again. And the final, what is also not totally clear and not in advance discussed enough, is how can we find correlates of biodiversity in ponds? This is based on a concept that we call assumption of uniformity of nature. It uses the so-called inductive inference. So we collect one pond after the other. For example, here in the diagram, you have a correlate, say, pond size versus biodiversity, for example, richness, and you would add all these little blue dots here and would expect that somehow you can predict the biodiversity from the correlate X. And this is uniformity of nature. We assume we have to explore a little bit these rules, but once we have the rules explored, we don't need to continue because we understand the system. But what's happening here? You find a pond that is totally deviating. It might be extremely small, but nevertheless, the richest in biodiversity you have ever seen. And spontaneously, many colleagues would say, well, we made something wrongly during the sampling. This can't be a real fact. But this is just based on this assumption that nature is uniform, that there are laws that can predict what's happening. But philosophically, it's totally unclear whether uniformity of nature is only a structure of our thinking. So we are forced to think on uniformity for example, because we have a memory. So uniformity of nature means also where's the sunrise every morning. But if you would have a memory that is very short, just 6 hours, you would not remember next morning that you have seen a sunrise before. And in that way, you wouldn't experience uniformity. And therefore, that we have a memory may be also the reason that we think nature is uniform. I have talked about the richness and richness as a surrogate for biodiversity. But in the initial thinking about diversity and biodiversity, there was a discussion that the most important parts or the most important function of biodiversity is realized in the interactions among individuals. And indeed, in the very early time of talking about diversity, the Shannon Diversity Index was developed in a way to reflect the intensity of interactions among individuals. So you certainly know all this Shannon Diversity Index, but what we would have to know and have to study is the abundance of all potential interacting populations in each of the ponds. And secondly, we would need to know what are the interactions, what is the type of interactions. This is really difficult to be realized in ponds, to have such a fine-scaled overview about the abundance of all potentially interacting individuals. And you can easily imagine that at the scale of the entire study, 240 ponds, this is even more challenging. And so the question is, of course, do we have other ways to learn something about the interactions among individuals and how they contribute to ponds? And there is indeed a concept that you certainly know that is called meta-communities. So in brief, we have here on the right 3 ponds colored differently, meaning that the composition of species is different. The interactions among the species within the ponds play a role which species can survive. And these 3 local communities are connected with the regional species pool. And from the regional species pool, then again, organisms can disperse and they are filtered by the environment. And finally, they are then again part of the local species pool. And in 2010, Welland has suggested that the major axis of understanding meta-communities or community assembly processes can be summarized as selection. Selection is whether individual or species fit to the abiotic niches, the realized interaction niche filters. The second big group is dispersal, so individuals migrate between ponds from the general regional species pool. And if we can reach other pools, other ponds at the end, we can form or contribute to the local community. We have also stochastic changes in species abundances that are called drift. And of course, in the long term, we have also to consider that species may emerge by speciation or go extinct just by chance. So within these concepts, we can certainly analyze our data in a way that we get a better understanding about the interactions among the species. And what we have used here again is the data set from the 6 countries within Europe. But you see here by the different symbols that these data do not originate all from the same location. But as I told you before, we have 4 to 6 so-called pondscapes that are distributed over the countries. And what we have collected here are fishes and amphibians, presence, absence by environmental DNA. And for macroinvertebrates and zooplankton data, including rotifers, we have used netting. We have also used the position of each pond. This is simply the geographical coordinates. But to reduce the effect of spatial autocorrelation, we have applied the so-called Moore and eigenvector maps. You don't need to understand it, just this removes the issue of the autocorrelation. And then we have included in this analysis 10 abiotic pond correlates that were related to pond morphometry, productivity, and structural complexity. And you can model the species or the populations occurring in the ponds by so-called joint species distribution models. So this is primarily a decomposition of assembly processes, as I have mentioned before, by an R package. So at the end, we had 115 identified species in the 4 organism groups I mentioned before. So fishes, amphibians, zooplankton, and macroinvertebrates. And according to the spatial organization of our data, we could run in total 13 different models. The first one was the semi-continental one, covering all 6 countries in Europe. So this was one model, and the maximum distance among the ponds was about 1,700 kilometers. And when we switched to country-specific, so regional models, so the maximum distance among the ponds was roughly 200 kilometers in each of the countries. And finally, we have used an even finer spatial extent, so no more than 20 kilometer distance, where we have included data from 1 or 2 pondscapes. And we always had the question, what is the contribution of environmental filtering, species interactions, and the spatial location arrangement of ponds to reflect dispersal? And with a particular focus on the interactions, is this model capable of identifying interactions that we well know? For example, predator-prey pairs, fishes and amphibians, or fishes and zooplankton, or among competing species. So do we find, for example, evidence for negative interactions among odonates? And let me start with a very coarse overview. We usually use these kind of Venn diagrams to reflect the contribution of the 3 processes to the overall pond community assembly. And you see here at the semi-continental European spatial extent, we have approximately half of all variability explained. So this McFadden R square is a kind of explained variance. And you see that the pure contribution of space is almost inexistent, but we have environmental contribution, so filtering by abiotic predictors, and a contribution of associations that can be interpreted as species interactions. If you go to the country-wide model, so I have just plotted here Germany, but the other countries are pretty similar. You see spaces, again, unimportant environment and species associations play a role. And it's interesting to see that both co-vary. That seems to say that associations are also related to differences in environment. And this is even more visible in the pondscape specific spatial extent. So just including all the ponds from one pondscape in Germany. And you see the covariation between environment and associations is maximized. And even the total predicted variance is 0.86, suggesting that only 14% is remaining that is stochastic variation. This is a pretty surprisingly strong power of this model to predict which species exist in ponds and which species co-occur. And this was the second step, and this is a little bit difficult to explain. Consider we have a handful of fishes, we have a handful of amphibians, macrozooplankton, and zooplankton, and we want to study how many of the potential interactions in this group is at the end in the model with a significant outcome. So you have to calculate first the theoretically possible interactions. So if you have 10 fishes, for example, we can have in total 45 interactions, so all pairwise combinations. But you can, of course, do it in the same way also, fishes with amphibians, fishes with zooplankton, etc. And in the graphs, I also have the same spatial extent decrease from Europe over countries to pondscapes. And you see we have 2 colors here, blue and red. Blue means that we have a significant positive interaction that is saying 2 species co-occur repeatedly and significantly. And you see that the total amount of, say, positive interactions increases with smaller spatial extent. So here we have many cases, for example, fishes, where 20% of all potential interactions that are possible were significant. And you see that in particular among the groups of fishes, among the groups of amphibians, among the groups of zooplankton and benthic invertebrates, there are many positive interactions. So simply saying, it is not really clear in which way we assumed negative interactions, so negative co-occurrence, why it is not so important as with positive co-occurrence. But not to say, I mean, there were also a few negative co-occurrences, negative interactions, and very clearly here, for example, fishes and zooplankton and fishes, amphibians, negatively co-occurred. And this would suggest there is an effect of fishes on zooplankton and fishes on amphibians and several other pairwise interactions as well, that would in principle give more weight that interactions play a role for organization of pond communities. But what is a little bit strange is that we see such a strong effect of a spatial extent. And this comes to the question, what do we know about interactions in ponds? And you certainly have seen this matrix several times. What is the effect of species 1 on species 2 or vice versa? And if you have a double minus, we would say, well, it's negative for both of them. This should be the case of competition. And if it's positive for one but negative for the other, it's predator-prey interactions. But we don't know much about the positive, the double pluses, for example. What have we ever learned about facilitation, for example? So what is the contribution if two species co-occur? How can they help each other? And if you ask further, how can interactions in ponds or in any aquatic system at all can be detected, when we would say, well, in principle, only by direct observation. You would have to see whether one predator feeds on a prey. All other methods are indirect. So we could, for example, derive an estimate of the importance of competition by seeing whether growth and performance is affected by a competitor. You could also use diet tracing to see whether predators have fed on prey. But you can also use these indirect versions or the indirect ways, for example, this joint species distribution model. But we have to consider in the context of species distribution models based on species presence absence, that the pairwise interactions that we see, whether negative or positive, can also be induced by predictors we do not have included in our model. So if, for example, we ignore the predictor that enforces the common occurrence of two species in all the ponds, then we would say this is reflected in the species interaction matrix. So we have a double plus, but in principle, it is caused by something else, by a joint abiotic predictor. Furthermore, interactions, as we discuss here, should induce a change in occurrence of species, so changing the presence-absence matrix. But this leads to a logical conundrum. On the one hand, if predator-prey interactions should be established, we need both predator and prey at the same place. This would suggest we have something like a double plus, so they both should occur at the same place. But on the other hand, we expect that if predators feed on prey, they must have a negative correlation. So in a way that the predator reduces the prey. And so the answer here is, or the question is, and we don't have a good answer, would we expect in such a model that predator and prey pairs co-occur positively or negatively? This cannot be predicted by this simple scheme. And of course, the bigger question is then, can we achieve causal inference? So something is causing an effect at all. There is a surprisingly strong increase in papers describing something like causal overhaul in ecology, future directions for causal inference in ecological research. So I've seen at least 5 papers during the last 2 years dealing with this question. And one of the fundamental approaches here is you have to develop something what is called a directed acyclic graph, DAG. And here the example from literature is what do we have to know to evaluate the effect of group size on individual vigilance or group vigilance. So here saying, consider there is a group of species, a group of individuals from the same species, they are exposed to predators, and both the individuals within the group, but also the entire group, would certainly see predators earlier, detect them earlier. So something like the many eyes hypothesis. And this seems to be very simple. You would just vary the group size and then check the group vigilance. But for causal inference, you need much more. So all what is here in red are the so-called confounder variables. All what you see in blue here are mediators or competing variables, and you have a few gray ones that are just redundant to the vigilance. So you would have to understand for each type of interaction exactly all the potential factors that play an additional role. You can easily understand that it is almost impossible, even for a small pond, to make such a graph for all potential interactions. And so at the moment, there is only one outcome. The outcome is that prediction means better understanding than just correlation. So if you split your data set, you would say half of the data set is used for training, and the other data set is used to see whether the predictions from the training data set matches with observations in the second part. So this is something what still shall be done with our data set. But here I would like to say that with causal inference, so something interactions cause a reduction in, or causes a extirpation of one species from the ponds. So predators are so strong that they really wipe out a prey species, that such causal inference is extremely difficult to find. And the final topic I want to cover here is the applied aspect of pond conservation. So I always start this discussion with giving you a task. So you have a limited amount of money, and you can spend it in either this pond or the pond below. The upper one is a wonderful pond. You see it has beauty, has a lot of biodiversity, and if you could buy all the land around the pond, you could make it an untouchable sanctuary. And the alternative is this a little bit muddy pond, what you see here. It's located in a village. People walk around, interact somehow with the water. There's a playground. So this is really a place for activity of humans. And because the pond is drying out every year, you could say, well, if I invest the money here, I could keep the water table stable by pumping water into this pond every year. And this would be clearly a multi-purpose use. And if you have to select, I know that many of my colleagues from the natural research would say, well, clearly we start with the biodiversity. This is much more important. How do we identify ponds that shall be protected? This is totally opposite to what I have explained before with this inductive inference, where we added ponds to understand rules. Here we really have to find a single pond. And this definition can go via logic, so deductive inference. We have two premises. The first premise would be, for example, the highest biodiversity shall be protected. And the premise two, pond Z has the highest biodiversity. So the conclusion automatically is correct. Pond Z has to be protected. But while the conclusion cannot be debated in the deductive inference, of course, you can question the premises. And here we have again the question, what has to be protected if biodiversity is everything? And the second, related to this red dot here, how to find the pond with the highest biodiversity if you don't include all ponds in your study. And with premise one, what has to be protected, I always like to tell you a story. While we were working in Germany, there was one single pond that was really extremely muddy and had its very strong smell and was in no way appealing to work with. And you would, of course, say, well, this is in a very bad state. But certainly, if you would dive deeper into this pond and take, say, a sediment sample, you may find a population of chironomids, for example, with an extreme genetic signature. And if we want to keep genetic diversity, it would be valuable to keep this pond in this very bad, muddy state, just to keep the genetic diversity of the chironomids. And then, of course, everyone, natural researchers say, well, we don't care about the chironomids. What is important are amphibians. And here we switch from the facts to what I call values. What are values? Here you see the cognitive hierarchy model of human thought and action, and you see values are on top of a pyramid. Values are really something that is absolutely central in our understanding and interpretation of the world. Values are reference points for evaluating things as good or bad, so not true or not true, but really something good or bad. They are very strongly binding rationally and emotionally, and they give people long-term orientation and motivation. And you have certainly heard about the so-called honest broker concept for researchers. This goes back to a sociologist, Max Weber, about 130 years ago, who claimed that researchers are only responsible for making facts available, while the decision about the facts should be delegated to the politics. Sorry. But the question is, we as, say, natural researchers, are we free of values? So can we really deal just with facts? And biodiversity is a very good example that we can't. We do have values. So values in the concept of philosophy make normative roles. So there is a role for our understanding. And this comes from the way how we are educated. It's very classic that even we are framed by a daily work in so-called philosophical silos. So we rarely check which alternative explanations are possible if we do everyday research. But if we think about biodiversity, then it becomes quite difficult to explain in which way we justify this concept of highest biodiversity. Because if biodiversity is a goal, then the ultimate value would be maximization. So we would like to maximize, for example, richness. And then we should construct novel ecosystems, because when we have a higher ecosystem diversity and richness, we should release non-native species just to have higher diversity. We could even release genetically modified organisms to have higher genetic diversity. This makes very clear that biodiversity as a standalone concept does not hold any ethical value. So this maximization does not work. And therefore, we can see biodiversity only as an umbrella concept for metrics necessary to assess the distance between a fully natural system and the system we find. So what we as natural researchers value is not biodiversity as such, but naturalness. So this is the highest value we can have. And therefore, misusing biodiversity as a goal for naturalness is a dead end in a way, because when we come into conflict, what do we measure and in which way do we consider the outcomes of our research as being important for conservation? So from the other perspective here, I come now to the stakeholders. I told you before that we had also demo sites, and within the demo sites, we had also some ponds studied. And we have run 3 workshops with stakeholders and have applied several questionnaires. And one I want to show you for a moment is now we have asked them, you living very close to a pond, what do you value highest for the ponds you know? So what is the preferred importance of ponds from the perspective of the stakeholders? And this is, of course, not so easy, because there are many, many things that can affect the valuation of ponds by stakeholders. I just make it simple for you for understanding. We made a distinction between so-called socio-economic benefits, that is recreation, education, provisioning, business and jobs, planning, and social justice. And then all the environmental and biodiversity benefits that are also grouped here into 6 categories, and then also having a few subcategories attached. But what for us is very important is that the stakeholders had a huge potential to express their preference for many different ways of importance. And if you see the summary here, this is the 8 countries, and you see above the red line always here the environmental benefits and the socio-economic benefits below. You see that the response was quite similar among the countries except Uruguay. And you certainly know in Uruguay, these ponds are created artificially to water cattle. And therefore, the socio-economic benefits had a higher importance for the stakeholders in Uruguay than in most of the other countries. But here, this brownish color, this is around 20% that the stakeholders value the life cycle, and this includes biodiversity. In contrast to the high value of naturalness for natural researcher stakeholders, the local stakeholders have a different perspective on their ponds. And what is the reason for it? It is that they are affected by something that is much more than just research. We call it major socio-cultural phenomena. So they are, of course, driven by emotions and values, but these are framed by institutions and their culture, how they are educated. And not to forget, they also perceive benefits in the dimension of aesthetics. So many stakeholders told me we are not so much interested in which biodiversity is in a pond, but we like if the pond looks nice. So just from the aesthetics. And this comes to the point that instead of focusing on facts, we have to try to comprehend. So the German original word is verstehen, to comprehend the subjective meaning that an action has for an actor. So instead of relying something what you can measure, you have to ask people individually, what is the subjective meaning of your, say, relationship to a pond? And the reason for such a difference is even bigger. We call it worldviews. So how reality is perceived and interpreted. And you see that there are totally different ways of seeing biodiversity or nature as important. You can consider it as an instrumental value. So what is the benefit for humans from nature? You can say, well, nature has an intrinsic value. So this is a value in itself. You don't need to justify it further. And the third big group are so-called relational values. So in that way, nature is important for human relationships. In a way, humans interact with nature, but also humans interact within nature. And when you see that here, the intrinsic values play a big role in biocentric and ecocentric worldviews, where people say, well, the most important thing is nature, it's biodiversity, and this value does not need to be justified. But you have also here in the weakly anthropocentric and pluricentric worldviews a substantial contribution of relational or in part instrumental values. And this relates, of course, to the question I had before. In a situation of very limited funding, if you would choose the untouchable sanctuary, this is clearly reflecting that you have something like an ecocentric or biocentric worldview. But the challenge here is it perpetuates the nature-culture dichotomy because it's saying we have to exclude humans to keep nature. Naturalness is possible only without humans. That is, of course, another conundrum. How can humans that are, of course, nature, why should they exclude it from nature to keep naturalness? And the alternative for multi-purpose use is related to pluricentric or weakly anthropocentric worldviews, because explicitly the nature-human relationships are taken into account. And let me close it more or less in that direction. We as the natural researchers often focus on the direct drivers of this biodiversity loss, but essentially there are much more important questions to be asked here. We have indirect drivers, but we have much more the underlying causes. And one of the big causes of the problems with biodiversity declines is a disconnection from and domination over nature in people. We have a concentration of power and wealth, and there is setting priorities on short-term individual and material gains. These are the true underlying causes for the biodiversity decline that we rarely take into account when discussing it. And I don't want to give you all the strategies, read them. I mean, I really can recommend that you take a look into this fantastic paper here. But I just want to mention number 5, that societal views and values have to be modified, that the interconnectedness of people and nature has to be established and maintained. And this is really something important, that if we exclude people from nature to save a naturalness, what we think is important, then we make a step in the wrong direction, because when this interaction with... Yeah?
We're running out of time.
Oh,
I'm sorry, but could you finish?
Yeah, I can.
5 minutes?
Yeah. I certainly have got some recommendations, but anyway, what I at the end would like to say, in a summary, that humans have survived may indicate that the empirical knowledge of the world partly matches the reality. So natural researchers aim to acquire knowledge and theories closer to the truth, and philosophically, this is correspondence with reality. If we want to transform the world, we have to switch to something that is pluralistic and pragmatic. What we need to achieve is ethical coherence among all stakeholders, that we agree upon an aim and that we agree that we understand each other well enough. This is a totally different thing between the correspondence with reality. So the coherence in ethical considerations is a central aim of these pluralist and pragmatic approaches. So the take-home message, you may have asked yourself, what was it about philosophy? It was just about science. Yeah, that's true. Doing science is doing philosophy. And I just would like to motivate you, think about your own normative and epistemological grounds, define early what the study objects and subjects are, discuss the approaches that really address what you want to study, understand that the topics linked to conservation are mission-oriented and founded on normative concepts, so there are values included also of the stakeholders. And finally, consider that not all the ontologies and epistemologies that you encounter are rooted in empirical research. The consequence is accept that natural researchers are not the gatekeeper of a single truth. Thank you.
We could ask one question, please. One only. Podemos hacerla en español y Padmini nos ayuda con la traducción. Les presentamos aquí a Padmini que va a apoyarnos con la traducción. Si alguien gusta hacerla en español, ella nos apoya.
No questions.
Bueno, lo voy a decir en español. Sí. Muchas gracias por la plática, doctor. Realmente estuvo muy interesante. Bueno, en este caso, ¿cuál sería el futuro de todo de englobar todo este conocimiento para en este caso, para la nueva ciencia que se está haciendo, pensando en que la mayoría de artículos se basan en cuestiones positivas siempre, ¿no? Entonces, ahorita hablando de englobar muchísimas variantes, estamos hablando que puede haber un cambio en el conocimiento. Entonces, ¿cuál sería el futuro de este cambio dentro de esta perspectiva negativa de que ahora todos los estudios están saliendo positivos gracias a que vemos este paradigma de la ciencia que llevamos desde mucho tiempo y pues yo creo que está cambiando constantemente y ahora toda la situación es positiva en la cuestión de muchos de los artículos y como lo estamos viendo.
Yeah, I need a translation, please. I mean, my Spanish is not fluent enough to get it.
Okay, thank you so much. He was saying that the talk was very interesting, so thanks for that. And he was asking, what's the future of science, considering that most of the articles that are written with this positive view, based on all the paradigms that have been established and followed through up until now. So taking into account the shift in all the variables and how science is not strictly going to be positive from now on, where do you see the future of the shift in knowledge and the way we gather knowledge
going to, moving forward?
Well, I mean, the fundamental contribution science can deliver with respect to conservation and, say, transformation science is primarily to accept that this is an interaction among many groups. It is not that we have the truth and tell other people what the truth is and they have to follow, but all these big questions are interaction, co-design, accepting that there are pluralist approaches, other thinking in other groups, and bringing all these things together. So this dominant position, what we have as natural researchers to understand the world and the others don't understand, is certainly nothing that will be the future.
Could you please repeat your answer once more?
My answer was that natural researchers do not have a truth about the world in the way that they teach others what to do and how to change, but rather the interaction among all stakeholders, taking into account their individual worldviews, is the way forward. And this is called co-design, joint development of knowledge about the world, and this is fundamental for conservation.
Okay, thank you so much. Se estaba mencionando que la comunidad científica no son quienes tienen como que una única respuesta, que el cambio ahorita va más dirigido como a integrar los diferentes puntos de vista que existen, como en estos codiseños de, como con todos los actores involucrados e interesados. Entonces no es que solamente una fracción de toda la ecuación tenga la respuesta, sino que se necesita integrar los diferentes puntos de vista para poder generar este cambio que integra a todos los agentes dentro del mismo sistema. Thank you very, very much, Doctor. I give the microphone back to Dr. Sio.
Okay,
Thomas,
thanks.
it was a pleasure to have you here. I really appreciate that you talk for us. It's a very interesting topic, and surely we are going to have a lot of things to talk, trying to follow your guide. Philosophy is not easy for limnologists or scientists, but as you say, it's necessary to think that when we are doing science, we are trying to understand complex things. So we have to think that the philosophy is more than the Greeks taught us several centuries ago, and the philosophy is more pragmatic, as you have shown. So thank you very much, Thomas. It was a pleasure to have you here in the Mexican Congress of Limnology.
Yeah, thank you for listening, and thank you for inviting me.
Gracias. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Muchas gracias, doctor Tomás. Hasta pronto.
Yeah, I can disconnect.